Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me in the studio this week we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line, live from Luton, Spike columnist and author of Beyond Grievance, it's Rakib Ehsan.
Hello.
Coming up on today's show, the uselessness of Rishi Sunak, the insurrection in Russia, and the truth about racism in cricket. So it's been a pretty terrible couple of weeks for Rishi Sunak. The consensus at the moment seems to be that he's not going to miss his key inflation target. The economy isn't growing as he had promised us as it would be by now. And even his pledge on the small boats is also looking a bit shaky now that his flagship plan, the Rwanda scheme, has been struck down in the courts. Tom, I mean, is it starting to dawn on people that maybe Rishi Sunak is a bit useless?
I think so. And I think it's interesting that it's this week that it really feels like the crows are starting to circle, because aside from all the kind of Westminster melodrama, the kind of things that people expected to bring him down, more pantomime over Boris Johnson or whatever it might be, it was always going to be something like this, because his kind of entire reason for being, his entire pitch as to why he had to be anointed as Tory party leader by Tory MPs was stability, was delivery, was giving them at least a couple of things to show for themselves when it comes to the next election. And it does feel like this is the week in which, with more of a whimper than a bang, all of that has kind of come undone, as you suggest. When he was brought in, it was very much about trying to get a handle on what was going on in the mortgage market, what was going on in the economy more broadly. Inflation is stuck at where it is. Core inflation is actually going up. And of course, we've had average mortgage rates are back to where they were just in the wake of the not so mini budget. So on that score, he's completely failed. Obviously, we'll get into it a little bit later. Less in his hands, the question of the Rwanda scheme, more kind of, a question of the kind of legal limits which exist to hem in democratic policy making, which is a slightly different question. But at the same time, again, demonstrates his inability to deliver, his inability to grasp that particular nettle, which was always going to be a difficult fight that he picked on that question of dealing with the small boats. And it's just such a striking contrast when he first came in October 2022, where he did get, I wouldn't say it was gushing praise, but it was pretty warm. I mean, even James O'Brien, Hampstead's favourite shock jock, said something to the effect of, it does feel like an adult is back in the room.
Yeah.
I think Paul Wall from the Eye said a couple of months ago that, whisper it, but Rishi Sunak is turning out to be very competent as Prime Minister. I don't think they'd say any of that now. But I think it does remind us that technocratic, very managerial kind of style of politics, it sells itself successfully to the media, unsuccessfully to everyone else as it's brilliant, we're competent, we are here to deliver. And not only is that kind of bloodless, but often, and we see this with Rishi Sunak, the claims to competence are also bogus.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing with Rishi Sunak, really, at this point. The adults in the room have no idea what they're doing either, once again.
It seems to be more than a mood than an actual, than any proof of this competence. I mean, Rakib, what have you made of Rishi Sunak lately? I mean, he's posed as Mr. Fix-It. What has he fixed?
He's fixed very little, Fraser, if truth be told. And I totally agree with Tom that he sold himself as kind of very sort of promising sound management of the country's affairs. And there's kind of, this technocratic competence, if you could call it that. Not many people, it's not only the case that people find it distant if you try to manage the country in such a technocratic way. There's very serious questions to be asked about delivery. And I think this is a real problem with the Conservative Party government for some time. There's a huge gap between the rhetoric. They talk a good game, but when it comes to the bread and butter of policy delivery, they're failing in a number of areas, particularly the small boats emergency on the English South Coast. We've had the Court of Appeal ruling today saying that the UK-Rwanda migration partnership is unlawful, don't consider Rwanda to be a safe third country. Now, there is a debate to be had, of course, that perhaps we should introduce legislation which curbs the power of these judicial interventions, whether they be foreign or domestic. But the government really needs to move away from simply talking a good game, in a sense, saying what they think people want to hear, and really step up its efforts in terms of actual policy delivery. And I think that if your personal brand in Rishi Sunak's case is ultimately emphasizing that I'm a competent, responsible individual, I'm a grown-up, at the moment he's failing miserably. And I think that's reflected in his own personal ratings.
And Tom, I mean, sticking with migration, I mean, it's not just the judiciary that have been seeking to frustrate Rishi Sunak's plans, it's also the Lords. But at the same time, he has backed away from having a fight with those groups. He could, as Rakib suggests, pass legislations to overturn some of these rulings. He could. Why is the government not abolishing the Lords? The Conservative 2019 Manifesto promised serious reform of the Lords, and that's clearly not going to happen in the next couple of years.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the two things which are true here at the same time is, on the one hand, there has been a very anti-democratic attempt to frustrate the Tories' migration policy, which, even as somebody who doesn't like this Rwanda policy, I've found very chilling. Whether that was the late in the day injunctions in our domestic courts or whether it was a European court frustrating that flight out from Rwanda. But at the same time, he's never had any stomach for the fight on these questions. He would never go anywhere near, for instance, pulling out of, say, the European Convention on Human Rights, which has been cited in this Court of Appeal ruling today as to why it's unlawful to send migrants to Rwanda and so on. He's never had any stomach to take on the House of Lords. He also doesn't have any kind of room to do so, even if he wanted to do so. So weakened is he by his party's particular position, his own lack of any mandate whatsoever. He was just anointed by Tory MPs. We should remember that. And so on the one hand, one's back does go up at these kind of attempts by various different factions of the establishment to frustrate the intentions of the government of the day. But at the same time, you can't get away from the fact that that he's making it too easy for them, and the whole project has just become so desiccated at this particular point. It really does feel like there's just no, even he doesn't know what the point of this is at this point, and that's something which you struggle to see how he could regain any kind of sense of momentum in the run up to an election. Where would he get it from at this point?
And another key failing seems to be the culture wars. This is somewhere, again, where he occasionally will pipe up, say something interesting. The other week he made a joke about women not having penises, and Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, needing to have biology lessons up to the age of 18. But, in the past couple of weeks, we've seen some pretty horrendous stories come out of schools in the UK. A school in Essex, for instance, there was a girl who was sexually assaulted in a gender-neutral bathroom. We've heard about, that was reported in the Telegraph and in the Sunday Times. We learned about a pupil who was socially transitioned behind her parents' back. In fact, even given hormone treatment, referred to a doctor without their parents' knowledge. And all this while Rishi Sunak promised that there would be tougher guidance for schools by the beginning of this summer term that's just gone. So, Rakib, there's no progress on that front either.
No, not really. And I think that it's all good cracking jokes about Sir Ed Davey in private discussions. But as I said again, and this is exactly the point that Tom made as well, there has to be direct policy actions that make a meaningful impact, whether that's the small boats emergency or deeply problematic incidents in schools. I think that the effects of radical transgenderism are a very serious threat when it comes to the integrity of sensitive female-only spaces. We've seen a number of episodes which support that claim. I just feel that the Conservative government, it's just in so many areas, they make it's a sort of culture war rhetoric, saying what they think that much of the public wants to hear. But ultimately, if you want to be in government and you feel passionately about these issues, I don't really see that level of passion when it comes to actually driving forwards the kind of legislation that could address these very problems which they are supposedly so passionate and care about.
And Tom, we're just drifting towards a Labour government at this point.
I mean, it does feel like it. And also, if, like us at Spiked, you really don't like the kind of dry managerialism of which Rishi Sunak has made kind of an art, then you're really not going to like it. Starmer very much either. I mean, they are kind of, the same bloke in two different suits to a certain extent. It is that very depressing sense that we're back to the kind of early 2000s status quo ante, where you do just have these kind of competing bank managers, project planners, where there's no ideology, there's no passion, there's no colour, there's no vision. It's just, I can run the country better. I mean, all of Labour's attack lines at this point, it was like, we would do this but better, we would do this but more competently. It's a battle of the competent, and no one gets out of bed for that. I think it's going to be interesting to see how many people switch off from the next election entirely. And it's one of those things, I know a lot of people in the media, as we were kind of gesturing to earlier with some of the praise that Rishi Sunak got, at least for a while, really have been pining for that return to that sort of Blairite managerialism, when everything made sense, all the parties looked the same, the public didn't get a look in. They love all that time. But it is worth reminding them that not only is that not what the public wants, not only is that an incredibly lifeless and dull way to do public life, those people also failed time and time again. These people with their pie charts and their experts and their orthodoxies and so on. And in the middle of this cost of living crisis, we're having to pay for their mistakes again. So it is worth reminding that when you have people like Sunak, you have people like Starmer, who try to present themselves as the person who can just steady the ship, as the adult in the room, whatever cliche it is they're throwing out. Time and again, it's proven that the adults in the room are two children in a trench coat, effectively. And I think that's what we're seeing again now with Sunak.
I just wanted to let you know that Brendan O'Neill's new book, A Heretic's Manifesto, is back in stock on Amazon. Also, if you want to get a hold of a signed copy of the book, our special offer is still running. If you donate £50 or more to Spiked, you can get your hands on a signed copy for free, and it will be delivered straight to your door while stocks last. To donate your £50 and to get a hold of your signed copy of A Heretic's Manifesto, just go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate. And also, we'll throw in a year's access to Spiked supporters. That's our online donor community, which comes with all kinds of other brilliant perks, just as a way of saying thank you. So Russia was rocked at the weekend by an extraordinary armed insurrection. The Wagner group and its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, essentially left the battlefield in Ukraine, crossed the border into Russia, took over a major military headquarters, and then started to march on Moscow. Now, this mutiny, rebellion, insurrection, whatever you want to call it, was over within about 36 hours. But, I mean, the implications are pretty big beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, it was one of the most striking moments, not just of the conflict, but all of Putin's time in power. You know, he had a direct challenge to his authority. It is worth saying that Prigozhin was very much framing this as against the military leadership, particularly Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, who he has been kind of like openly beefing with on Telegram for many weeks and months over being undersupplied, them effectively just not backing up his Wagner forces, particularly when they were fighting in Bakhmut, you know, ranting in front of piles of bodies behind him of his own men and so on. So this kind of open argument has existed for some time, but it did go up a notch. He did even seem to make some subtle digs at Putin himself. He was also talking pretty openly about how the rationale for going into Ukraine was bollocks as far as he was concerned, and that this was all just about Shoigu wanting a medal, and this was the idea that they were about to launch some sort of attack on Russia was nonsense, and the idea that they're full of Nazis is nonsense. Now, it's hard to, as ever where Russia is concerned, kind of pick through the propaganda and what actually happened, what the actual motivations were. I mean, it's worth stressing that Prigozhin is not some sort of liberal reformer desperate to take Russia in an anti-war direction, far from it. I mean, he's leading a brutal mercenary group who, shall we say, make the Russian army proper look like the most upstanding armed forces in the world in terms of the sort of things they're prepared to do and have been prepared to do. But at the same time, it is an incredible challenge to Putin's authority. It's this one of the things which has really kind of exposed the fact that whilst from the outside, particularly given its very kind of the state's very authoritarian term in the midst of the war, that it's also very fragile.
Yeah.
That this kind of oligarchical setup in which you have kind of competing interests and so on can make things very difficult when the going gets tough. And that also this reliance on mercenaries, people who are ultimately not necessarily loyal to the commander-in-chief, to the presidents of the nation, but are doing it for money and loyal to their own particular commanders, is an incredibly dangerous and destabilizing thing. So I think what it's reminded us is the fact that even though I don't think it's going to move the dial on the war anytime soon, I think people are getting a little bit ahead of themselves, or were, when the uprising was underway. It does remind you that the the regime that we're talking about here was never kind of the ironclad, coherent body that it might have seemed from the outside.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that in many senses that doesn't make it any less dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ukrainians have long warned that actually the real danger is the weakness of the Russian leadership. That is, one reason why it has been so aggressive externally, almost to make up for its kind of internal weaknesses and fragility. I mean, Rakib, what have you made of this incident?
Well, I found much of the commentary bizarre. There's so-called sort of anti-Putin liberals in the West cheering on Prigozhin as he marched to Moscow, which is absolutely bizarre because, as Tom has said, that the Wagner Group's conduct in various parts of the world, not just in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also in Syria and parts of Africa as well, they make the Kremlin war machine look a bit soft. Based on some of the things that they've been accused of. So I found a lot of the commentary suspect, to say the least. I know that Prigozhin, his criticisms are very much directed towards the Russian military establishment, not so much President Putin. But there's no doubt that these events, even though Prigozhin now is exiled in Belarus under Lukashenko, he has undermined President Putin's authority. He's probably the strongest undermining of his authority since he really was in the top tier of Russian politics, in my view. So I think there's no doubt that it was one of those moments where I think that, once again, many people, their lack of understanding of the conflict was well and truly exposed. And I think the risk of Russia, descending into a civil war, considering that the number of nuclear warheads that Russia has, it'd be a serious threat to the very stability of the wider international system if Russia was to descend into civil conflict. So I think what was interesting really is that there's many commentators in the West who are very involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They comment on it a great deal. But if you look at their commentary during the Wagner Group's march to Moscow, it truly shows that they don't know what was at stake, and they don't really know much about the Wagner Group itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's kind of anyone but Putin type attitude, and often what people forget is that actually, while Putin does have many opponents, many of them are more hardline than he is in terms of their views on the Ukraine war. Much of the criticism of him has been his failure to capture Kiev, not that he's too bloodthirsty.
Yeah, no, completely. And it is one of those things where you do wonder whether people recognise how significant it would be if, as Rakib was sketching out there, you did have this kind of fragmentation within Russia, full-on civil war. I mean, this particular kind of uprising has reminded us of some of the characters involved, whether you're talking about Kadyrov in Chechnya or you're talking about Prigozhin now exiled or whatever. You have various different components and competing interests, and even in some cases kind of competing armies effectively that are at play here. I mean, you're talking about a country that big, if you're talking about a country with that kind of nuclear arsenal, this is not unimportant. And whilst of course we all want Ukraine to repel this invasion and to triumph and to defend their national sovereignty, the sort of slightly childish glee with which some people are kind of willing on almost the collapse of the Russian state does need to be called into question.
Yeah,
and I think some of those people fulfill the worst stereotype of Western supporters of Ukraine, as if all they're really interested in is just getting rid of Putin, which is not why I think the vast majority of people in the West do support Ukraine. They're fundamentally concerned about that nation and its defence of its sovereignty. But yes, it has exposed not only the short-sightedness of some of those people, but also, frankly, the fact that they obviously don't really know what they're talking about. I mean, within about 5 minutes, Anne Applebaum thought that the entire Russian state was going to fall apart, but it didn't work out that way.
Yeah.
Did it? So it was one of those things where it was revealing as much for the takes as for what actually took place. But it is fascinating as to what's going to happen next. Is Prigozhin just going to be allowed to mill around Minsk with his private army? I mean, presumably he's going to be keeping away from windows and cups of tea for a while. But it's going to be fascinating to watch, not least and important to watch because, as we've all been talking about, the stakes are very high here.
Yeah, and there's a sense that has he, in some ways, got away with it? He's not being punished that severely
yet.
Yet.
You would be amazed if something did.
Yeah.
Happen, but we'll see.
Well, let's see. So English cricket is racist, sexist and elitist, according to a landmark new report by the Commission for Equity in Cricket. Rakib, this report is pretty extraordinary. What have you made of it?
Well, it's extraordinarily bad, in my view. I never thought I'd see the day that I'd see a report into the state of cricket in England and Wales, and in the forward would be a specific mention of a police homicide in the US state of Minnesota. And I think that really tells you how this particular commission was set up as BLM was emerging as a social movement in the UK in response to the police killing of George Floyd in Minnesota. What was very interesting for me was that the commentary within the report, it was littered with what we would consider to be these kind of sort of radical cultural terminology, cisgender, for example. And I think that really shows how aggressively US identity politics has been imported into the UK, to the extent where we're seeing the political and cultural Americanization of what is a quintessentially British sport. In my view, I've argued this for some time, that for me, the main barriers in cricket are class-based. For example, maintaining cricket facilities can be quite expensive, as is purchasing cricket-related equipment. There's been the selling of state school fields. As you know, cricket is a game where you do need a decent amount of space just to have a game. Just to have a proper cricket match. And I think that more generally, of course, there's no doubt that when you look at cricket, those who have attended private school are, if you want to use that term, overrepresented. But then if you look at the England cricket team that won the 2019 World Cup, incredibly diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, faith, social class, and country of birth. So if you're arguing that cricket suffers from this sort of widespread racial and ethnic discrimination, and people ultimately, many people in cricket are contaminated by racial prejudices, I don't think you would have seen that kind of outcome where such a diverse national team would emerge victorious in what was a very competitive tournament. So I think that more generally, when you look at the report, I think that it's deeply unfair on the game itself. And I think, in a sense, it didn't truly focus on what I consider to be the main barriers when it comes to participation in grassroots cricket in England and Wales.
In a sense, I mean, Tom, if we've been here a bit before with cricket, I mean, we had the Azim Rafiq allegations of racism.
That's what I thought would spark this report.
I know,
Before I looked at it.
Yeah.
Apparently it was George Floyd, as if, the cricketing associations of Britain had some sort of nefarious involvement with the Minneapolis Police Department. But anyway.
It was a weird summer. I mean, everyone lost their
minds.
Of
reviews were open. A lot of people were sacked. There was a lot of stuff going on.
A lot of black squares posted in tribute. But yes, it was sparked by the George Floyd thing, not by any genuine accusations of racism. But even, when going back to those allegations around Azim Rafiq, some of them turned out not to be true. You think about poor old Michael Vaughan, who was accused of being racist, accused of making racist remarks, which lots of other people said they didn't hear and couldn't back up.
Yeah, I mean, he was sort of dragged through that show trial, effectively. He was, he was, I believe, I forget the exact name of it, but the kind of cricket discipline board or some such, which had kind of had essentially this hearing. I mean, he was suspended from the BBC, where he's obviously a commentator, and he was effectively presumed guilty until those allegations completely unravelled. Azim Rafiq had made this claim that Vaughan, the former England cricket captain, had made this kind of slightly strange remark. But the other teammates who he claimed were also witnesses to it either didn't remember it or said that they didn't think he was being racist in saying it. So it was one of those things where it's become, again, just as soon as something becomes a narrative, it's very easy for that to propel all kinds of investigations, all kinds of things forward. No one wants to be that organisation which is seen to be, in quote, not taking these allegations seriously. But I think it's so important that organisations have to grow a backbone and resist some of this stuff to the extent that they're not already completely captured and they're just doing it to themselves. They need to be able to say no. And it's getting to the point where, because of this ludicrous new anti-racism definition of what racism is, you see a report being discussed in the media like this, and your immediate assumption is that it's bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, that's a really bad place to be in. Like, and then you open it up and you realize, oh yes, they're doing the kind of the standard procedure, which is to say you make broad sweeping assertions, you use a deeply Americanized cultural language, you try and apply that script over here, you take what might be some instances of some genuinely unpleasant stuff, but then try to present that as proof that the entire organization, institution, game, whatever, is riddled with this stuff. It's almost like any instance of it is proof that the whole thing is rotten.
Yeah.
Not the vast majority of people would not accept that that's how you measure the racism or sexism or anything of any particular organization, but that's the standard that's being applied, often in a not particularly transparent way. They just declare something institutionally racist and don't even necessarily explain what they mean by that, even if they understand. And it's gotten into us in a really bad place in general, where our discussion about racism, discrimination, the extent to which it persists, what to do about it, has been so blurred by these sort of racial entrepreneurs, as it were, these people who are pushing this new anti-racism on us, that you hear an accusation like this and your first instinct is skepticism. And that's not a particularly good place to be in either,
Yeah, Rakib, I mean, is it possible in today's climate for any institution to defend itself against this accusation of systemic racism or institutional racism? Because it can just mean anything.
Fraser, I think the ECB shot themselves in the foot the moment they sort of helped to set up this independent commission. It was an absolutely bizarre decision. And if you look at some of the recommendations, it clearly shows that this so-called independent commission has a deeply problematic ideological bent. For example, it suggests that the annual matches at Lord's between Harrow and Eton and Oxford and Cambridge University should be scrapped. Now, you could scrap
Racism
these
solved.
fixtures. I don't understand how that would boost diversity, equality, and inclusion in English cricket by scrapping those fixtures. Listen, I attended a state school, but I think it's just a very clear ideological hostility towards tradition and private schooling. That's what it boils down to. Eton Harrow is one of the oldest sporting fixtures in the world. It stretches back to 1805. I'd also make the point this year's match that Harrow won, his Victoria's skipper was called Veer Patel. So this idea that this is just, two bunches of white, privately educated schoolboys, just having a hit around Lords, that's really not the case. Quite often these teams are quite diverse. So I think it's very clear that the Commission had an ideological bent. I think, for example, for me, there could have been some very good practical recommendations. I think there should be more opportunities for state schools when you have sort of state school competitions for those finals to be played more often at Lords, Edgbaston, Trent Bridge, Headingley, Old Trafford. So I think in a way you can maintain those traditions, you can maintain those traditional fixtures, but build on that by making those historic cricket grounds more accessible for working class kids in inner city schools that love their cricket. So I think that in a way, if you want cricket to progress and you want it to modernise, you need to bring the traditionalists with you who are quite influential in the game. And I think that would be a more practical way of making the game of cricket more inclusive, as opposed to these problematic, ideologically driven recommendations that we saw in this new report into the state of cricket in England and Wales.
And Rakib, it's not as if cricket is a particularly white game, would you say, if you think of the other than England, the great cricketing nations?
And that's the problem that I have with these reports, because I think that if you're sort of a young ethnic minority Muslim who loves the game, and you even have ambitions to play for England, I don't think this kind of report is actually very helpful. At all. If we see in the last decade, we've had Moin Ali, Adil Rashid, Zafar Ansari, Hasib Hamid, Saqib Mahmood, and most recently Rehan Ahmed. All of them have made their test debuts for England in the last decade. And I think actually, if you look at sports, English sport more generally, I don't think there's one sport where you have that kind of sort of multi-ethnic, multi-race, multiracial, multi-faith composition, especially when it comes to the national team and many county teams in the English cricket circuit. So I think all in all, I think that the report was unfortunate, and I think that it was overly doom and gloom when it talks about the progress that English cricket has made and the integral part that it plays when it comes to being the basis for social cohesion in our modern democracy.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.